First of all, welcome everyone. Welcome to Community Insights. This is a program series of Victory Human Services. My name is Richard Ward, and I am the director of the Acquired Brain Injury Program here at Victory. And today, I will serve as your moderator for this event. So once again, welcome. This webinar will last a little more than an hour so that you may all get back to your busy lives. And while we hope to have a really great interactive discussion, I want you all to be aware that you too can participate if you have questions. I want to call your attention to a chat feature, which allows you to share your thoughts or ask questions. I intend to pick out some of those questions throughout the presentation. So if you have something to share, please make sure that you do so. So meeting the challenge of the pandemic, minority organizations and philanthropy is the first of several discussions that Victory will host throughout the coming year. We truly hope that you will enjoy today's discussion. Will join us once again in the near future to discuss other important issues. To set the stage for this conversation, 2020 has been a year that we will never forget. It started off in January with the World Health Organization declaring COVID-19 a worldwide pandemic. And after close to 2 months of confusion, concern, and uncertainty, on March 10th, Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker declared a state of emergency in Massachusetts. And that state of emergency set limits on gatherings. It set travel restrictions. It closed many businesses, perhaps many of them for good. And while we all have concerns about what was to follow, I can't imagine that anyone could have ever dreamed that our response would have been so haphazard or ineffectual. No one could ever imagine or thought of as of last night that we would have 230 US citizens that have died from this horrible disease, and it's still not over. So the results have been catastrophic, as nearly 10,000 Massachusetts residents have died and tens of millions are now unemployed. So this is a really serious issue. And if you're like me, when was the last time you've shaken a person's hand, given out a hug, or even seen the bottom of a friend's smiling face? This is truly our new normal, and we have to deal with that. To complicate matters even further, this year we've seen our share of racial strife, and for many, the realization that inequities do in fact exist. As these protests and the fight continues for many, it is fair to say that we still have a long way to go. And then finally, and in 1 week, we have this thing called an election taking place. And regardless of whatever your political affiliation is, we know that there is a lot riding on this election, as well as our community's response to the challenges that I've outlined here. And when I talk about communities, I'm talking about our nonprofits, our business community, our philanthropic community, and each and every one of us who will play a role in our response and our recovery. We have a role in bringing this thing to a close and ushering in a brand new reality. Fortunately, we have an outstanding panel here this afternoon to help us take us into this new reality. And with me today, I have Leandrea Brantle. Leandrea Brantle is the co-founder and chief operating officer of Victory Human Services. She'll share a little more about her background here in a moment. And we also have Jocelyn Sargent. Jocelyn is the senior director of the new philanthropic group, the new Commonwealth Racial Equity and Social Justice Fund. This was formed by Black and Brown CEOs who were concerned about issues around racial equity and others. So let's now talk about our new reality and how we can respond to the challenges of this day. I'm going to ask each of you to give a brief introduction of yourself and your organization. And I'll start with Leandrea first, given that this is 20 years of service that Victory is now in operation. So Leandrea?
Thank you, Richard. And hello, Jocelyn. It's good to see you again. First, I want to make sure I welcome our Victory family and all of our guests to this conversation today. We really wanted to take time to talk about some of these important issues. But I want to talk about just Victory just for a couple of minutes. We are 20 years old this year. We started back in 1999. We started with one contract for $65,000. And this year our revenue will be about $18 million. So we are very proud of this long and bumpy road that we've come down. Our current services include adult foster care, We also have a division that works with developmental disabilities. We run 24-hour homes. We do what we call in-home support. We do shared living. And then we have our acquired brain injury program. And that program works with folks who have acquired some kind of brain injury. There are multiple reasons why people get brain injuries. They could fall, it could be a car accident, they could be a veteran. So we have a number of reasons. Some of the big challenges, I just want to talk about that for just a minute or so. Some of the biggest challenges we faced early on in Victory's history was getting financing to get Victory started. And so scaling so that we would have sufficient manpower and sufficient funds was a really big issue. And I'm hoping later on, Jocelyn and I will talk about that a little more. But I just wanted to give you a quick snapshot of who we are.
And hi, thank you so much for the wonderful warm welcomes from both you, Richard, and you, Leandrea. I'm Jocelyn Sargent. I'm the executive strategic consultant for the new Commonwealth Fund. And as Richard pointed out, they're a group of 19 Black and Brown executives that came together in June following the horrific murder of George Floyd, but also in the wake of the pandemic and all of the disparities that were laid bare, especially in terms of what Black and Brown communities are facing. So the higher degrees of economic insecurity, the health inequity that I think has been with us for quite a while, but really became more apparent. So these issues really help to, we've all been motivated, but help to further motivate this group to not only do what they can do individually, but more importantly, to come together and to leverage their collective time, talent, and treasure in service of racial equity and social justice. So I'm excited to be here to talk to Victory, as well as to share a little bit more about the new Commonwealth Fund. And I should just say a little bit about myself. I'm, in the Boston area, I'm considered a newcomer. I feel like I've got some roots down here, 4 years here. And I am coming to the work with over 2 decades of experience in philanthropy. I started my journey in philanthropy at the Open Society Foundation, which is a foundation that was created in the late 90s with George Soros backing. And then I've also most recently come from the Kellogg Foundation, as well as coming here to Boston specifically to head up the Hyams Foundation. So that's all to say I've seen a variety of philanthropic experiences, and I am so thrilled to be able to talk about them today.
Great. Thank you so much. Leandrea, I'll ask you the first question. I wonder if you, Victory serves more than 600 clients, largely disabled minorities that come from a variety of different programs, as you so well mentioned. What kind of impact has COVID-19 had on your clients and, of course, the staff that have to service them?
So it's had a huge impact on both our staff and clients. Most of our clients and most of our staff come from communities that are at higher risk. And so what we found is that we've needed to get more resources in the beginning, particularly PPEs, out to our staff so that they could serve our clients. There are issues around depression, anxiety. We've had issues around no, people, I'm not sick. I just got allergies. I have allergies. I apologize. So, food assistance, just checking on our staff, both our staff and our clients' wellness checks. Just the mental health piece has been huge for us. So I would say food, mental health, making sure that people are safe, communicating with them really well over these past 6 months has been a priority.
Jocelyn, do you want to add anything to that? I know that it's not a situation that you're sort of working in, but based on what you heard, is there anything that stands out for you?
Yeah, there's a lot that stands out for me there. As I mentioned, we started in June, so New Commonwealth Fund is less than 6 months old. But one of the things that's very different about this fund is we're trying to learn from the experiences of folks on the ground, folks like you guys at Victory, and so we are very much in a sort of a learning stance and really curious about how groups like Victory responded to this pandemic and then the following kind of racial, I don't know, and economic insecurity. I don't know how to quite describe it, but I think in our trying to figure out how to be responsive to the community, the first thing we want to do is to learn from how community groups like Victory really did adjust to this time and how we can better support that.
Thank you. And Leandrea, unlike a lot of organizations, Victory was in a unique position to take advantage of some of the available resources, government resources like PPE, CARES Act, and for the first time, you've gotten to really reach out to philanthropy, particularly private philanthropy, something you typically haven't done. What are you doing now, and why has this become so important to you and in organizations like yours, like Victory?
I'll answer that really quickly in two parts. It's become essential for us right now because we really want to make sure that we take very, very good care of our community. And when I say community, I'm talking about Victory staff, I'm talking about the clients we serve, and I'm talking about the families of the clients we serve. And so it's essential that we are responsive to the needs of our community. So when, one of the things we wanted to do, we realized that we were under-resourced very, very early on in this. And so our senior leadership team volunteered. We hadn't done grants before, but we were determined that whatever it took to get the job done, whatever we needed to do collectively, we would do it, and we weren't going to leave anybody behind. So we wrote teams of people got together, wrote those grants. We got we did get a grant that just addressed, the first grant just addresses food security. So we've been able to subsidize both our families here in the greater Brockton area and our families that are in the greater Boston area with food support. We've also been able to supply both our staff and our clients with things like PPEs, hand sanitizers, masks, and all that kind of stuff. But honestly, if we go back to 2008, we had a tentative plan to deal with any kind of natural disaster. And then as we got ready for national accreditation in 2017, we really, really started focusing on what would we do if different kinds of emergencies happened.
And Jocelyn, anything you want to respond to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's again, the fund really is a responsive fund, and we're in the middle of fundraising as well as trying to figure out what the needs are in communities across the Commonwealth. And I'm just curious about what it took for groups to reorganize and be responsive to the clients in the communities they serve. So for example, you're going about your work every day, and then all of a sudden you have these additional barriers to whatever budget and plan you have for the year. And so I've just been really interested in hearing more about the stories that folks like you guys at Victory can tell us about. How did you get in the forefront of that, really big, once in a generation, once in 100-year event of the pandemic? Because I think that really does help us understand kind of what communities are facing and what nonprofits work looks like. We think about impact, but this is a moment where we're both at a relief point as well as an overall systems impact. We know systems are not working. And at the same time, you still have to deliver to your clients. So that's kind of one of the things I'm curious about and loving learning from you guys.
Well, our plan today is to really have an open and honest conversation. One of the conversations we had with our larger leadership team, which is 32 people, was that it is imperative that as a minority agency that we are absolutely prepared for anything that might happen, whether that be a flood. We went through the marathon bombing situation where people couldn't get into work. And so this notion of being prepared has been deeply ingrained in all of us here at Victory. So we were doing live scenarios. We had already identified an offsite location where we could go if something happened to this building. And then we did mock-up scenarios. What if this happened? What if that happened? So as our team really began to hear about what was going on in China, that got us thinking at that point. And so we really got ready. We made sure that we had sufficient cash out of the bank. We started deploying more equipment home, back home to our accounting and our finance staff. What we know historically, let's be honest here, is that when bad things happen, people that look like us tend to get the short end of the stick. We saw that in Katrina, we talked about that. We saw that in Haiti, we talked about that. We saw that even most recently for some of our younger staff, they remember what happened to the people in Puerto Rico, which is the United States. So our task here is to make sure that if something is coming, if something is going to happen, that we are able to take care of both ourselves and the people we serve. I mean, with 100% sincerity, saying, there's a saying that we have around here that I said at the time, which is this, we're just doing a drill, but nobody's coming for us if something happens. And that sounds can sound extreme, and I can feel people smiling all over the building. If you already know in advance that no one's going to be rushing to your rescue, what would we have to do? And so what plans would we have to do? And the other thing we said was we must be, we actually used a term SWAT uses, which is stay liquid, stay fluid, right? Don't freeze up. Like whatever we need to do, if we need to do this or do that or go here or go there, get the resource there, whatever it takes to get it done to ensure the safety and wellness of our community, it has to be done. And so our amazing team has really taken that on, and that allowed us to be ahead and stay where we still think that we're ahead, creating phases for a pandemic. When we talked to some of our funders, we were met with skepticism. Why are you guys doing that? Why are you setting up a communication tree? Why are you identifying who's going to be the key person if something should go wrong? Nothing is going to go wrong was one of our last conversations with one of our big funders. And I think less than 7 days later, we went into a state of emergency. Needless to say, when we call and ask for things now, there's no more skepticism. Everybody says, oh, okay, so we're ready. When we talked about in June, we're getting ready for the second wave. Mm-hmm. Everybody went, there was no skepticism. They said, we're getting ready now. So we're getting things in order.
Leandrea, one of the things that
I just wanted to add a point, which I don't know why I forget because it's so pressing on us today. Earlier today, the Boston Foundation hosted a webinar on Race to Lead. It's a report that local funders like the Boston Foundation and BAR have supported. And what it talks about is the disparities, the inequity in funding that a group like Victory might experience because you have not only a Black person leading it, but a Black woman leading it. And so the way in which organizations that are people of color led, women led, get less resources, get less traction. And what occurs to me as you're speaking, Leandrea, is that not only does it put you at a disadvantage for like when things like a pandemic hit you, it also, the rest of the sector loses out and on what you've had to contend with to sort of stay afloat, to stay liquid. So the rest of the sector loses out not only on, it doesn't lose just because the organizations that should be receiving funding are not, because there's all kinds of implicit bias and active discrimination going on in terms of leadership by Black and brown people of these nonprofit organizations, but we also lose out your innovativeness. So the stay liquid part. So that's what we're missing when we're not paying enough attention to organizations like you. We're missing that ability to be ready for hard times because you're constantly facing hard times. So I wanted to add that because, it's a sector loss as well as a organization loss.
I agree.
Great. Leandrea, one of the things that I know that happened that was really important to this organization is that back in, I think it was about 2 years ago, is when you started that planning process. A lot of organizations don't start that process that early. And so it's really interesting that you were set up for this planning, and then when the pandemic hit, you were ready to respond. What advice would you give to other organizations that might not be in that situation or haven't done that?
Yeah, it is absolutely imperative that we have that you have a disaster plan, and not a disaster plan just for bad weather. Anything that would interrupt your business, you need to have a plan for it. But once you have your plan, you must train your team very, very thoroughly on what the plan is, so that everyone up and down the chain knows if this happens, this is what we're going to do. I mean, that is the key, because just to have the plan in a book somewhere that nobody has in their head, because it's been 3 or 4 or 5 years, somebody wrote it just because they needed to write it, is not helpful. People can't then move, they can't pivot, they're not sure what to do. I do want to say that one of the other things that we did very early on, actually before they declared a state of emergency, is we started meeting every day. We first did it by conference call. Those of you who are on the call will remember. And then as we tested out our new technology, we went to something called Teams. So talking a minimum of once a day was our standard, but some teams talk twice a day, their whole team talking. Company-wide meetings, sending out emails, sending out text alerts, really making sure that people weren't confused. Our community was not confused about what we were saying, when we are going to do things, and exactly what we're doing. So agencies have to put those systems in place. I really just can't stress that enough, particularly for agencies that look like ours, because if you are not ready, this is like a tsunami that can just roll over you and crush your agency and really cause more havoc in our communities. We made a commitment early on that we were not going to lay anyone off. We think that economic security is a major priority for folks in our community, as people were shutting down all kinds of places. Does that answer your question, Richard?
Yeah, that's fine. And when you think about what in terms of that preparedness, and then you got hit with COVID, what would you estimate the costs of additional resources that you had to expend as a result of it?
Easily, I mean, $500,000 comes immediately into my head, because we immediately did things like we gave a one-time payment for our essential frontline workers. We immediately gave them what we called a COVID-19 stipend. We began to, try to source and buy PPE. So we sourced some of our PPEs from China, and we had a couple of our shipments confiscated by the U.S. government early on in this process. Some folks who were on those calls understood that if any PPEs came into the state of Massachusetts, they disappeared. So it really was challenging, and we didn't know if we would get those funds back and how we would get those funds back. But we were committed to really making sure that we did everything that we could for the communities that we were serving, and everything that we could for our staff. We set up an EAP program because we saw very early on, as the racial strife was going on, there was a lot of anxiety and stress and just a whole bunch of emotions going on. So we recognized that and immediately set up an EAP, thanks to our HR department that moved fast on that within a couple of weeks.
And so what's the response been from the philanthropic community around these emergency kinds of issues? So I'm just wondering, Jocelyn, if you might comment a little bit on that, because your fund was formed like right around this time that the pandemic hit, and the same with all the racial justice issues that occurred. And so, what was in the mindset of those funders about how they would both shape their funding, but also perhaps drive some sort of change, whether it's systemic or just provide support for the different issues that are going on? What's most important to this group?
Yeah, so I think that there were a number of funds that popped up right in April, in response to the pandemic. I think issues around health equity really became more prevalent, and groups started to understand that we actually have to take a social determinants of health approach to looking at health equity. That it, but there also is just straight up healthcare access to the right medical care, the testing. So I saw a number of relief funds. So that's not exactly what this fund set out to do. I think this fund and the number of the different corporate executives, their companies also had relief funds. That was just something that was more prevalent. I think after the murder of George Floyd, I think there was a clear understanding that this is not just about one particular moment and a relief for that moment, but this really portends to a larger structure, a structure of inequality. And so when New Commonwealth Fund came together, it was with that thinking of disrupting that structure and shifting so that better outcomes could, arise. I think that that's still the focus of the New Commonwealth Fund in each one of the areas. We definitely have a health equity area that we look at, and I think it's less of a relief, although we know people need that and there are those places. But I think it's more of a systemic shift. And I will say that there are a number after the murder of George Floyd, and we became more fluent in understanding police violence in situations like the murder of Breonna Taylor. I think that there were a ton of national funds that started to look at Black and Brown led organization. I think that there is less support for services. They tend to fall under the relief space. And I think we've got to do a better job in philanthropy of connecting up the direct services to the systems change work. Because I think siloing that out is not going to help us serve our people.
So, Leandrea, I see you shaking your head. So, what do you respond to that?
I mean, I just agree with this notion of putting them in silos. It's not working for agencies like ours. So that just really resonated with me. That's why I started shaking in my head. Yes. So we appreciate that. Thank you.
Now, I know that this is the first time that an organization like Victor, even though it's about $18 million in revenues that it's had, has really tapped into. I mean, you've tried in the past. You've mentioned before around tapping into philanthropy and hadn't been successful. And now you spent $500,000, $500,000 to support new efforts. And we also have a question from the panelists, one of the other participants here, that talks about ways of breaking into philanthropy. So you're sort of re-entering back into this frame. What's the best way to break into philanthropy? I guess is one of the questions that came from one of our members in the chat room. So this, Jocelyn, I don't know if you have a comment on that, given your background and experience.
I think I think what I've seen be effective is it's something that Brian Stevenson, who started the Equal Justice Initiative Institute in Montgomery, Alabama. And I think he mentions, and he's better known as the person that Michael B. Jordan played in the movie Just Mercy. He's a lawyer, and he's just done really solid, work around criminal justice, particularly as it applies to the death penalty. And one of the things that he raises is this need to be proximate to the work that we do. And I think that is the way to sort of break into philanthropy, is to sort of just invite folks to come see your work, to just come and think with you, to be a partner in helping you identify resources and other philanthropic routes to resources. I think one of the things that I have been able to do from time to time in my career, and I definitely look to do it every time I can, is it may not be that I'm the group that I represent a group that can help you, but I can find a group that might be able to help you. And that my relationships with other funders, is important to bring to the table in the same way that any resources from the institution I represent are important to bring to the table. So I would say the best way to bring in is get to know, people who can be advocates. I think program officers don't hold the secret purse. So when you're working with program officers, get to know them and help them be advocates for your work. So I think that's the best way to break into philanthropy.
We have a question from one of our members in the chat room that's talked about what's the value added of having a fund led by Black and Brown executives. So what are they bringing to the table that's different is the question.
That's a really great question. I think I'll say in all of my years in philanthropy, and I've worked in traditional private foundation philanthropy for the most part, the national level and even, at the local level. And I think what happens a lot is that for these hairy social justice issues, that a lot of the times we are looking to the nonprofit sector to solve it. And I think that bringing together the 19 Black and Brown corporate executives really does help not only leverage their personal resources, their institutional resources, but also their talent and time. So their ability to partner with nonprofit organizations to strategize around these issues. I think that that's what's different. I think, again, back to the silos, if we have Black and Brown folks over here doing their thing, Black Brown folks over here doing their thing, I think we're just less powerful. And so I think leveraging not only kind of the sort of philanthropy or what some more critical people might identify as a charity response. I'm just saying that's something out there that sometimes philanthropy only has a charity response. I think with the 19 Black and Brown corporate executives that I'm working with, they're looking to make impact. They're looking to do the work quickly. And I always say this to people, they are, my experience with them, when they brought me on, I was saying, okay, we'll do this, this, and this. And next year you'll be ready to make some grants. And they were like, no, we have to respond. And so I think that that's a different mindset that I hadn't seen in philanthropy. And sure, there are going to be some things that I wish we had done, but just the desire to act quickly is another value added from this corporate perspective that mainstream philanthropy does not exhibit. I'm not going to say they don't have it, but they don't exhibit the sort of urgency piece. This is the system, the system is this, and you got to trudge through the system. But I will say I'm hopeful because I think with at least COVID relief, the funding was put out there more quickly. But for the long-term work that Victory is doing, I would love to see philanthropy move more quickly. And I think that the group at the New Commonwealth Fund has that in their DNA. So that's long answer for a very important question.
We had another question from one of our chat room that talked about the ideal profile of an organization that philanthropists, but not necessarily talking about foundations per se, but philanthropists in general like to fund.
Yeah, there is a bias towards seeing that happy child. I mean, I know you've seen many ads for Save the Children. I mean, I think for philanthropists, we as a society have gotten into this habit that if we save the one, that's what's important. And I think sort of dealing at the root cause is really what's going to keep the one from being vulnerable in the first place. But I think there is a bias towards, well, who is that family, child, deserving person at the end of the dollars, that's going to, make the impact, demonstrate impact. And I think that we have to do a lot more work in sort of preventing. So like a lot of the things that you're preventing when you get ready, to respond to your clients, you're forward seeing, that stuff gets lost in terms of philanthropy's mind. It's less, it's more the apparent sort of, this person has been through a hurricane, here's a blanket, as opposed to building the levee. I think, Leandra, we talked about that earlier.
Well, I was getting ready, I was getting ready to go down that path and really talk about, the elephant in the room. And that is that there's a real bias towards agencies that look like ours, and they're kind of untalked about biases. So for example, there is this notion that Black and Brown organizations like Victory, are not well run, that we are not well prepared, that we don't know how to manage our funds. And I'm just putting it out there. And so when we go into the room, we don't get the same warm welcome. We get more skepticism when we come in with our presentation than a non-Brown organization. We're going to get all these other kinds of questions that another agency that had a different face would not get. And so that's off-putting to many of us, feeling like we have to meet a different standard than another agency with people who are not Black and Brown. And so I'd be interested. I mean, it really is what happens. And then when we are funded at a lower level, because there's less confidence that if you give us a large number, are they going to be able to account for those funds? So I'd be interested to hear from you what you think about what we're saying on the back end. And also, many of these, I just want to say, many of the agencies out here are run by folks who may not have the best writing skills. And they also have started the agency themselves. And so they might not have a development office with someone who just spends all of their time kind of politicking and, smoozing with the agencies, because they're actually out there in the streets doing the work. They are doing the work. And so if they're doing the work and, maybe they came, it's an immigrant, they came from someplace else, they don't have, big flowy English and whatnot. There's a bias against those kinds of organizations. You want the package to look pretty, but not necessarily have the kind of impact that some of these grassroots organizations have, but they can't really write well for the funding. So my suggestion has been, is there something we can do to support those kinds of organizations so that they can get the additional support?
Yeah, so there's a new-ish model in philanthropy called trust-based philanthropy, and it focuses on removing all of those kinds of barriers and really trusting the people who typically do the work every day to do the work every day. I think that when I'm struck by hearing sort of what's the ideal organization, because I would say that philanthropy tries to look at all of the same sort of dimensions across the board of what's an effective organization. The thing is, that has a bias in it. That's the problem. The problem is that there's a bias in it. And I think when we start to talk about, like, what I've heard and, conversations around risk, and is this a risky grant, which is kind of interesting and funny to me because, quite literally, it's a tax write-off. And I don't mean to be that crass. It is very much giving, but at the end of the day, it's a tax write-off. So I'm always unclear about the risk. If you don't have, if the group is presenting itself, they don't have a history of criminality, what's the assumption that there might be some criminality? But I do think that, we let our implicit biases play a role, because I definitely have been in conversations where I'm asking some of the questions that I've heard, and I might, the organization is led by a white male, and sort of the the response is, well, but that person might not have the experience, but we know him and he's really smart and he can do this and he can, create this program without any experience. It's fine. It's no problem. I think on the other hand, you may have a very incredible leader who can mobilize support, who can identify what the needs of the community are, a person of color, a woman of color. And, the first question, and I even hear this, which is just like amazing to me, but the first question that I hear is, well, I'd love to see where the financial expertise is. And so for me, that's like, where's the background? But they don't really have an MBA. They could have for me, I have a PhD, but I still feel like I've gotten that question. Well, you certainly can't count. And it's like, give me a break. I can count. No, I didn't go into accounting. No, I don't have an MBA, but you're questioning my ability to, find what I need to manage our money in a responsible way. And so I think that it's like the whole thing around, if you probably check off every list to make sure that one leader of color has every single skill in the toolbox. And that's not how we tend to look at, especially white male leaders.
Well, I really appreciate you just really being transparent today. And we rarely have this kind of opportunity to talk with leaders of philanthropy and just, be upfront about, what agencies like ours have experienced over multiple decades and why we kind of say we've just got to go it, do what we need to do without the additional funding. And this is just different times now where we really need additional support for our community.
Mm-hmm. We had a great question that came from someone in the audience where it kind of piggybacks on something Jocelyn talked about earlier, and definitely but the question was directed at Leandrea. It was really around whether or not you're finding people to be more or less generous during this era of COVID, if you think about like whether it was a hurricane or whether it was some other natural disaster or something, people tend to come out of the woodwork and do something, but it may or may not be systemic. And what you were talking about more, what was being discussed just a short while ago, or some of the more systemic issues around trust, type of organizations, those kinds of things. What are you finding, both in the short term and whether or not you're seeing anything different or expecting to have anything different as this plays out when we get past COVID?
So one of the things I'm finding is that for instance, when we were writing a grant, as we saw a disruption in the food chain very early on, we requested a grant very early on. And so I think that showed our forward thinking. And so when we're talking to them about what we think is going to happen and why that's happening and how it's affecting our families on the ground, because we have ears to the ground. And I think that the foundations responded positively to that. I do think in part because we were way ahead of the curve. If we look at something, I mean, a lot of agencies had trouble getting the PPP, which is the Paycheck Protection Program. So getting those funds. But our leadership team, if it got announced at 2:00 somewhere in an article, in a journal, on TV, I mean, they are on it. And so your ability to pivot and to respond and to stay liquid means that you're on the phone immediately, calling the bank and really just chasing after those things, which allows you to kind of mine those relationships that you already have. What's happening with the smaller businesses, I have friends who are running all kinds of other businesses, is they don't have those relationships. So they couldn't call somebody by name, for instance, and go and get those PPP funds. I do think as we move forward, because we are planning, 6 to 8 months out right now, we're just not thinking about right now, we're thinking about what's going to be happening in June of next year. And as we get a chance to share that with foundations, I do think because of they're more sensitive right now, more aware. I think that they're open to listening to, you know, what we're saying and why we're asking for these funds. At the same time, we're now developing a track record really fast of, you know, not only do we get the funds, we know how to account for the funds. We give you an update. You don't even have to ask us for an update. So we're creating a track record with that.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Jocelyn.
I was going to say, I agree. I don't want anything I say to be discouraging of folks trying to get dollars, because I think this is the time. I have seen people be more generous in philanthropy in the sector to do things a little bit differently, being open to do things differently. And we sort of follow the lead sometimes. So I think one of the great things about New Commonwealth Fund is that there are all these ways that we're not tied to any particular bureaucracy or any way to be other than what's responsive and works for us. But I think that philanthropy does follow the lead sometimes. And I think it's important right now for groups to ask. And even if you're not going to ask for resources, one of the things you might do is say, look, you may not be the funder that can resource me, but can you help me get visibility to other funders, you know, who might resource me, you know, or to donors, individual donors, because we're all as a sector paying attention to what each other does. You know, we're kind of, I don't know, I may get some pushback on this, but my 20 plus years of experience have, you know, one of the questions that I was asked as a program officer whenever I proposed some work, I would always get the question, who else is funding this? Who else is doing this? So I would just say, you know, get that visibility. There is more generosity among individual donors and foundations who are willing to do something a little different. So please get out there and don't write that off.
So to that point around, you know, getting more visibility and getting out there, one of the things, another great question that came out of our audience was really around, if you backtrack a little bit to like some of the biases that you spoke of earlier, there was a question really around how to help, you know, the community overcome those sorts of bias. Who's responsible for really addressing the issue? You know, the media, the government, educators, whomever, you know, but the idea of that bias is still out there. And how do we change that?
Yeah, I think we're all responsible for doing that. And I think that philanthropy has to look in, you know, philanthropy has a role too. We have to look inside and make sure that our practices don't have the kinds of things that we're actually trying to dismantle. I mean, I know you've seen foundations that want to dismantle structural racism, you know, and provide more social justice. But that said, you know, are you doing that in your practice? And that's a question that we have to ask. But I think definitely policymakers, I think sometimes you have to call the question with the funder. So I think that's a difficult place to be. I understand the power dynamics, but I was on an interview with a potential grantee, and you know, we asked questions around sustainability. That's always asked. I'm not sure why. I'm still confused about what would you do without our money. It's like, well, we're asking you for the money, so we kind of need it. But in any case, you know, that's a constant philanthropic question. But I think a question that was asked, like, in addition to funding, so which I think is a better way to ask a question, in addition to funding, we know you need money, what else can we do? And I think you have to be willing to put on the table what else can be done. And so this one woman, she was amazing. She said, open up your networks to us. You know, and it's like, I need you to call this person, you know, when I have a problem here. I need you to reach out to that person to help, you know, give us support around this issue. So I think that for that bias, it's in our society, and we all have a role to play, examining ourselves, being willing to be questioned and called to task. And I think that's a role that, you know, organizations like you can play. I'm sorry, Leandrea, because I can't wait to hear what you're having to say.
Leandrea?
I'm thinking I want you to open your networks, particularly with the George Soros Fund. You know, yes. You worked with lots of larger funds that have not just millions. I know. But I believe the Soros funds has several billion. Would I be correct in saying they have billions?
I mean, I think over the years that they've been in business, yes, definitely billions. I mean, George Soros is a multi-billionaire, of course, and so I am always telling my friends, the friends that I still have at Open Society, you got to come to Boston. You got to see some of the work, And I think, and I'd be happy to make a connection. And also, they're funders that I
There's a
may.
lot of smiling going on, by the way, Jocelyn. I had to just stop you.
Okay, yeah, that's
You probably
great.
can't hear. We do this thing where we're doing our hands in the background, so there's probably a lot of hands up, and that will not be forgotten. I know Habib Jallo probably almost fell out of his chair along with Albert. I can start naming names here, but
That's right. And you know what? The other thing I would offer to you is we would have a conversation and talk about, like, okay, is this the right group for you to ask? Or if you're going to ask that foundation, how do I best talk to you about how to position your ask?
Yes.
Because if it has to very much be in alignment with what they want to do too. So it's like a little bit of a partnership. But yes, Habib, we'll chat.
So I'd be remiss by not asking this particular question, given that we have an election that's a week away, and racial justice and all kinds of issues have been in the news, for quite some time, particularly around these issues. And so, do you, not being political or anything like that, but when you kind of think about philanthropy's next role, as of coming out of this pandemic, coming into the perhaps a new Congress, a new Senate, perhaps a new president, all these different things. What do you think philanthropy is going to do? In terms of what's the outlook for philanthropy in terms of trying to impact some of these issues?
Yeah, I that this is where I feel like there's been a real weak spot with philanthropy. I'm looking at Leandrea's vote earrings, and I think that there's been support for get out the vote work. I mean, it has to be nonpartisan. It can't be lobbying of any kind. If you're supporting 501c3, I do think. I do think that there was work that was supported for the census. We don't often think about the census count, but that's one of the things that's going to mean resources for us for the next decade. But philanthropy did put some money out there for the census and got involved with that. And I think going forward, what I would love to see is and I've advocated this among my partner funders, I would love for us to come together in the new landscape that probably will know what that is, November 4th, and strategize about, okay, so what does this mean going forward? Communities are going to need help with. Like, what types of policies do we think are going to impact our partners, our clients, And so I am hoping that philanthropy can be a little bit more strategic and not reactive.
Great. So we're coming close to the end of our time, but wanted to just sort of put out there any kind of, if you had a thought, Jocelyn, on with this new philanthropy fund that's being formed. I'm sure there are lots of people out there who are sort of thinking about, well, how is it that I can participate? Well, how do I learn more? Is there a role for us in sort of, getting involved with shaping, whatever strategy or policy that you're thinking about? Can you talk a little bit about whether there's a process in place for doing that and whether or not the community has any engagement in that?
Yes, I think we are about to embark in community listening sessions. I mean, I think that a lot have happened over the last 3 years, I know, or 4 years that I've been here. I think and we're trying not to recreate the wheel. So first of all, we're trying to learn from the community listening sessions that have already happened, both at, from the state and local levels. We will do more of those too. And I would ask you please to, when you get that invite, or if you're interested, to send your information our way, to say, I'd like to be invited to a community listening session. And so that's one of the first things that we'll launch later on this year. And I do mean calendar year. And we will also begin to set up advisory councils and advisory
Excellent.
meetings. And so those are things that communities can get involved in.
Leandrea, is there anything you'd like to ask Jocelyn while we got these last few minutes here? Is there anything related to philanthropy that would be helpful for Victory as it pursues, this is a new area for it, in terms of seeking grant resources. So any final, and there are lots of organizations that are in the same boat. So just wondering if there are any thoughts that you have about that.
So one of the big questions that has come is that we simply don't have capacity. Many organizations, our size and smaller, don't have development officers. Has there been any talk about not just funding the work, but also funding a development officer or a consultant that just doesn't help write the grant per se, but sticks with that agency? Perhaps they stick with us 18 months to take us through a full cycle so that we develop that capacity. Maybe they fund one development person over 3 small organizations so that we can really learn how to manage this and develop capacity. That's a real need, particularly for the smaller mom and pop organizations. Again, they're doing great work, but they especially during this pandemic, it's not possible for them to take on something else on top of this. So I wonder if there's any talk. I'm talking about for organizations that might be even under $100,000, daycare centers, which are, generally smaller, run by, family members. I'm talking about smaller businesses that also need help, perhaps to do some stuff to get open, to keep the children safe, but to keep our seniors safe. Has there been any talk about that?
Yes, I mean, I think with the new Commonwealth Fund, we very much have been looking at kinds of in-kind services that can be offered. I think for us, the concern would be to make sure that it fits the needs of a particular organization. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all kind of model. One group may need 6 months, one group may need 18 months, or may need to think about investing in a person or a position that does that. I'll tell you one thing that is really critical. Someone asked a question about sort of the ideal organization. One thing that I think is crucial is an organization that knows its work and knows its impact. So often, before I would recommend a development person, I recommend someone who can help talk to you about your impact in a way that makes a compelling case for an investment. Because honestly, that's how it is. But there is a lot of talk about that, supporting a development, kind of capacity building, also understanding how to, I don't want to say measure impact, but sort of understand how we make success happen and what kinds of things that we do are people that we have that contribute to success. And quite honestly, I think the nonprofit sector has a lot to offer philanthropy about what success actually is. I think it's not, I think there's some ideas we have, like the smiling children. Okay, they're smiling, they're not frowning. But I think that there are things that you're seeing that, like, when this happened, actually there's a broader impact here. And I think we need that learning. So yeah, I think that those are all kinds of things that we're thinking about. And, we need more assistance in trying to figure that out, especially, and I'm just going to say, especially for Black and Brown led work, and especially Black and Brown women work, women led work. I think that's an area.
I think that's a great point. And I think that, I've also spent quite a bit of time through the years in philanthropy. And one of the things that this pandemic in particular has sort of will create challenges for in the future is that so many organizations have been devastated by what's going on and the shutdowns and everything else. And so they'll be coming out of this, and there'll be needs everywhere, more than just what any one philanthropic organization would be able to support. And so the competition is going to be fierce, or the ability to choose, what they're going to fund. You can just imagine the multiple conversations that probably and likely should occur amongst philanthropy about what are going to be the priorities, because there's going to be so much need. So I don't know if you have a thought about that, but I think that's going to be a big issue in philanthropy in the next year or two.
Yeah, I mean, my thought is that's the job of philanthropy. I mean, I think a lot of times when I was reaching out to folks about a potential grant, they would always say, "Thank you so much for taking time out," which I appreciate, because I appreciate that in my heart. And it's my job, like I would say, except it is my job. It is my job to get money out in the right places. So thank you for helping me. So I think, your willingness to stay in dialogue, even when it's tough, even when it seems like the door is closed, I would still say reach out and keep in contact. Like, hey, that might not be the funder for you right now, but that doesn't mean that's going to be a forever. And encourage, funders to help you. If you can't give me a grant, really encourage, like, someone else, trust me, has that priority or that need. Some other philanthropic institution is going to say, but I really want to do that. And so we're in a better position to have that information than you are. So put the burden on us. And I mean, that's what I was going to say about trust-based philanthropy too, is it puts the work back on the philanthropic institution. So you don't have to worry that you don't present yourself best in written format, because there are other ways to find the information that we need. We really need to know if you're able to do the work. It's not, can you write a beautiful treatise on, the work that you do? It is like, literally, are you able to, do you know what the work is? And not that we do, but can you tell us about it in a way that we can learn? And what are you doing? And what do you need to do it? And do you have what you need to do it? That's really the questions that philanthropy needs to ask. Not like, are you, I'm sorry. I just get into that one.
I think that's a fabulous answer and a great way to sort of bring a close to our conversation today. I really want to thank Leandrea and Jocelyn for a very thoughtful dialogue today. I think that we've learned a lot about, both organizations, and in particular about what the outlook would be in terms of what philanthropy is what's to hold in philanthropy in the near future. So I think this is a great conversation. I also want to thank our audience members who participated in the webinar, and I want to invite you to join us again for future webinars that will be brought to you by Victory through this Community Insight series. I want you to share your thoughts. We're going to send you an evaluation. Just, give us your comments of what you loved about it and things that we might improve. But until we see you again, we really want to thank you for being here. Be safe. Get out and vote next week, and have a great holiday season. So take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Jocelyn. I'll talk to you soon. Thank you, Richard.
Bye, Leandrea. Thank
right.
you so much.